When you're reading the Bible, it's natural to try to take the biblical events and put them onto geography and meld them into history and look at the linguistics and see maybe if the details and maybe like the genealogies of Genesis 5 and Genesis 10 match up with the genetics, Y-chromosomes, let's say, of people spread across the world. And I've seen a lot of people attempt to find ancient place names and rivers and people groups and names of languages and say, oh, that's this person in Genesis chapter 11, and that's that person in Genesis chapter 11. That river means that these people migrate over here. Those are the sons of Shem versus the sons of Japheth. And I love that kind of work, and I've spent a lot of time in my life doing that. But over time, I've learned to grow a little more skeptical, shall we say. Sometimes the correlations are just a little too weak or a little too speculative or just, person putting too much imagination into the reality on the ground. Human history is a lot more complicated than most people realize. There's been massive migrations and wars and trading between places. So talking about genetics specifically, there's not really a reason to suspect that the genetics of people today are the same as, let's say, in the Table of Nations in Genesis chapters 10 and 11, because a lot has happened since then. I mean, consider Hungary. Hungary was taken over in the Middle Ages by a group of people that did not speak an Indo-European language, so they have a very strange language for a European people group today. But their genetics is European, because the people that came in forced a language change, but it's only a small group of warriors that took over the ruling of the country, not the peasants who lived on the land. And so most of the genetics of those people is European, not Mongolian or Eastern Asian or wherever the conquering tribe came from. So putting those kind of thoughts together, I'm looking at the Table of Nations and I'm trying to compare it to the Y-chromosome family tree. And suddenly I realized that things aren't what I thought. Well, hey, I'm Dr. Rob. This is Biblical Genetics. Today I'm coming to you from not Brisbane, not Cairns, not Atherton, not Sydney, Melbourne. That's where I am. They say Melbourne. Melbourne, Southern Australia. Behind me is a river. You can maybe see some of the cityscapes in the background. If you're watching on video, I know you people on podcasts can't see that, but you can imagine. There's palm trees behind me. There's some pears cracking in the trees. Everyone's wearing long sleeves today. Why? Because it's cold in Australia. I've been cold for an entire week, except for a couple of church talks in the city of Cairns, which is in the northeast corner, where they didn't have the air conditioning running. Up on the tablelands, a half mile in altitude, it was cold. I got to spend 2 days diving on the Great Barrier Reef, checked off a giant issue on my bucket list, but it was cold under that water. I was really surprised. I thought tropical waters always warm, and they were not. Now I'm down here in the south. I'm here for another week, and from here I'm going to fly to New Zealand for 2 weeks. I've been looking for an opportunity to finally record this episode. I have been so busy over the last couple of months with our social media video project that we're doing for Creation Ministries. We filmed, about 15 or so hour-long videos over the course of a week, and the preparation for that was intense. I'm also finishing up my first book. I'm also in the middle of finishing up my second book, and I have to write articles. And so the articles I'm writing for creation.com are turning into videos. In fact, you might have noticed there's a correlation between a lot of what I speak at on video and a lot of what I write on our website. Well, this is another one. It is the paper is now been submitted, it's being laid out, and so I'm filming this, getting ready for the paper to come out on our website. And so if you want to read it in more detail, there'll be a link in the show notes, as well as places where you can donate to help support this program. But just click on that link and you get the full-length article of what I'm about to explain, because I do not believe that you can place Shem, Ham, and Japheth on the Y-chromosome family tree. That is not what I would have said 10 years ago. I would have said, oh, this is the branch of Ham, this is the branch of Shem, therefore this must be the branch of Japheth. Yeah, I can't say that anymore because of multiple reasons. Now, this list of things I'm about to put out for you, I had some help in generating this. I actually put this on my Biblical Genetics Facebook group, and some people chimed in, and so my list got a little longer. So thank you for all my friends for helping with this, but this is partly your project. When we're reading the Bible, there's a very important rule of biblical interpretation, and that is we should not put into the pages of the Bible what is not there. we should not read our assumptions into what the plain words are. And yet I've done that before. I know everyone does it. It is human nature. So over time we learn, we get a little better, and we start to unpeel what we thought was true from what the words actually said. I know that in Christian history, orthodoxy was defined a very long time ago. So I don't have to worry about, defining the Trinity anymore. And I know that more recent times, conservative scholars have worked out the idea of inerrancy and inspiration. And there'll be links in the show notes if you want to find out more about how we know what the Bible says. Does it say what it really means? And were the people who wrote it inspired to write it that way? Those are very important doctrinal things for Christianity. There'll be some links there for you. So I'm not going to deal with that kind of material. That's background information that's already been done. I'm going to assume the inspiration, the perspicuity, it's a big word, means easy to understand, and the accuracy of the scriptures. And we're going to start digging into the genealogies and if they compare to DNA. Specifically, looking at the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10 and 11 and comparing it to the Y-chromosome family tree. Now, in preparation for this, I spent a lot of time building a brand new way of looking at the table of nations in Genesis 10 and 11. I used PowerPoint, which was not easy. If I had done this in like AutoCAD, it would have done instantly because you can rotate things by a certain angle. But I did in PowerPoint. It was really hard, but I finally got the table in a radial format with Noah at the middle, Shem, Ham, and Japheth around them, and their sons and grandsons around that in a radial format because I like to display genetic data in a radial format. It's everything spidering out from a central place. And I know some of the evolutionists complained about the creationists. Stop doing that, you silly creationists. You have to root your tree. No, I like using unrooted trees. So you can just see an explosion from a central point because that's the biblical story, an explosion from of the population from Noah. I know that there's archaeology, I know there's geography, I know there's linguistics, and those are amazing and fascinating fields. And I know that they have something to do with the Table of Nations and the Tower of Babel and the spreading out of people after Babel. But there have been many, many, many thousands of years since the Tower of Babel. A lot of history has happened. A lot of language changes have happened. A lot of cultures have changed. Sometimes the culture changes because a new people group moves in. Sometimes the culture changes because the people themselves develop new technologies. And so you have a totally different change of the material culture, and sometimes the genetics doesn't change, and sometimes it does. So when we're looking at archaeology, you've got to be really careful. When we're looking at this tree of Y chromosomes, we ought to have to be really careful. I know that specific Christians like Bill Cooper, who passed away a few years ago, he wrote a book that had a huge influence on me. It's called After the Flood. I used to promote this book heavily at my events, and then after years of thinking, it's like, I don't think anymore that the story is as strong as he suggested. But he did point out that there are multiple people groups in Europe, the royal houses of multiple different countries in Europe, traced back to a man named Shem, which is etymologically similar to Japheth. So there might be a memory there, but do the Y chromosomes match? That's the interesting question. Now, what I'm about to do is give you multiple possible ideas, multiple competing hypotheses, multiple things we need to consider all at once when we're looking at the Y chromosome tree and seeing if those really are the sons, grandsons, great-grandsons of Noah in that tree. There are so many possibilities, though, it's actually hard to get our minds wrapped around it. So one thing I want to start off with is explaining how human reproduction works, at least in the male. In the testes, male have cells called spermatogonia. They clonally reproduce, they divide, and after a while a signal happens, and then they go through meiosis, and that produces sperm. And so the sperm derive from these spermatogonial cell lines. But the spermatogonial cell lines are clonal, and they reproduce inside the testes, and sometimes it looks like they compete with other lines. So if you sample a man at different stages, you might actually get different spermatogonial cell lines are dominant or less common at different stages of his life. So as these lineages reproduce, mutations are occurring. And the reason we know there's different lines is because the different cells have different mutations. And over time, the man picks up more and more and more mutations. So we might have more than one spermatogonial cell line at the same time and they can be genetically differentiated. So if a man has more than one son, that son might have different mutations depending upon which line he came from. And older men, because they will have more mutations in their cell lines, they might produce sons that look different at different times of their lives. Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born to Noah after he was 500 years old. That's a lot of opportunity for mutations to occur. There's a lot of opportunity for different spermatogonial lines. So there's a possibility that there was, let's say, no mutation before the flood. This is hypothesis number one. Therefore, Shem, Ham, and Japheth would have had identical Y chromosomes, and therefore all the differences we see amongst the men today happened after the flood, maybe even after Babel. The Babel populations, they could have the same Y chromosome, and then the mutations that appear in populations today have built up since Babel. Or maybe Shem and, say, Ham came from the same spermatogonial cell line and Japheth came from a different one. If that was the case, there might be 2 Y chromosomes in the world, 2 Y chromosome root sequences. Which one was Noah? I don't know. We wouldn't be able to tell. We just know we would go back to 2. Or maybe Shem, Ham, and Japheth each came from a different spermatogonial cell line. Okay, then there's 3 Y chromosome lineages in the world. Each one compares to one of the sons of Noah, and we can collapse them down into Noah's sequence. Okay, great. Awesome. But there's more opportunity than that. So that's 3 hypotheses. Shem, Ham, and Japheth has the same Y chromosome. Shem, Ham, and Japheth have 2 amongst them. Or Shem, Ham, and Japheth have 3 different mitochondria. That's 3 possibilities right there. But amongst them, if let's say there's 2 or 3 different versions, they could be extremely similar, maybe only 1 letter off. Or they could be very different, maybe 100 letters different. Or 2 of them could be very similar and 1 of them could be very different. The number of opportunities here are actually profound. And so when we're trying to put our finger, say, that's where Noah is on the tree, we might not actually be identifying Noah. There's too much going on. There's too many other opportunities of, too many possible, people yelling background. It's hard for me to concentrate. Something else, though. The RATE project of 20 years ago from the Institute for Creation Research, the radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth project, they were trying to figure out how to explain radiometric dating in a young Earth context. And they concluded, using a lot of data, which I'm not going to go into, go to creation.com, type in RATE, rate. You'll get some summary articles. But they concluded there must be a burst of radioactive decay during the flood year. Specifically, of the elements that release alpha particles. Not beta or gamma, but the alpha emitters are the ones that decayed quickly. Very interesting. There's good evidence for that. But if that's true, then the occupants on the ark might have been irradiated. Their gonads might have been nuked. Their reproductive cells might have picked up a lot of extra mutations because of the burst of radiation. So we might have started with Shem, Ham, and Japheth having the same exact Y chromosomes. And then their gonads get irradiated, and the Y chromosome lineages inside their gonads might change. And so Shem, Ham, and Japheth might have had the same, but Arphaxad and Canaan and all the other sons and grandsons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth might have had radically different Y chromosomes because of the irradiation that happened in their fathers. Or maybe the floodwaters shielded them from the decay going on in the crust of the earth, and they didn't actually get a lot of radiation. Okay, but there's other evidence that the Earth has shifted its magnetic field multiple times in Earth's history. If that happened, it had to happen during the flood year, but every time the North and South Pole flip, that means the Earth's magnetic field has collapsed. And when the Earth's magnetic field collapses, charged cosmic rays can now enter the atmosphere. We lose a protection of the magnetic field. And if you get a burst of charged particles flooding through the atmosphere, the life forms on the Earth are going to get irradiated. So there's another way to get radiation into Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So what I'm saying is, I don't know how many Y chromosomes are on the ark. I don't know how many different lineages are on the ark. There could have been 1, there could have been 2, there could have been 3, they could have been similar, they could have been different, and the sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons could have popped up with radically different Y chromosomes, and therefore it's hard to know what Noah's sequence was. There's a couple more things we have to talk about, though. One is in evolution and in phylogeny, when you're building family trees of things. There's something called long branch attraction. That is this. If you have two identical sequences and over time they're in different populations and they're mutating, given enough mutations, the likelihood is that the same mutation is going to happen at random in two different lineages. But if you throw those lineages into a phylogenetic tree building program, it doesn't know that. All it's going to do is say, oh, that's the same mutation, so it's going to put them on a common link. If you have 3 or 4, say, mutations that happen independently in these two populations, it's going to bring them together onto the same stem. And they're going to look like they have a common ancestor even though they don't. Now, when I consider something like the Neanderthals and the long branches that they sit on, and the fact that they do share some mutations or some genetic differences or genetic variations with Africans, is that because they have a common root with Africans, or because they just happened, after having picked up many mutations, to pick up some of the same mutations some of the Africans have? That's an interesting question that can be studied by some other people maybe in the future. It's called long branch attraction. Therefore, just because you have this radiating tree with all these branches that come to a center point, some of those branches might be combined accidentally, just because they share the same mutations, even though they might have happened independently. And they can happen independently if maybe of the 60 million letters in the Y-chromosome, maybe not all of them are mutatable, especially considering we only sequence about 10 million letters. The rest of it is so variable, it's hard to compare one man to another. But the 10 million that we sequence, maybe a lot of those letters are important and can't be mutated. So maybe only 5 million, let's say, can actually mutate. But maybe there are physical things that cause like C's to change to T more often than A to change to G. Therefore, and that is true actually, but that means that not all mutations are as likely as others. And when you start restricting the number of possible mutations, the likelihood of independent mutations appearing in different lineages increases. Therefore, long branch attraction should be a thing. There's also the possibility that there are defective DNA repair enzymes. We know that if a person has a defective DNA repair enzyme, mutations will build up faster in that person than in others. We saw that in Lenski's famous long-term evolution experiment with E. coli. Fully half of his 12 bottles that they cultured for many years went through rapid mutation accumulation because of defective DNA repair systems. Ooh, that's interesting. So if you had a family, let's say, that had a defective DNA repair system, they could pick up a whole lot of mutations. But then if they intermarry with other families over time, that defect actually could be dropped off randomly and the mutation rate could slow down to the normal rate. So we can't look at those early branches in the tree and know how many mutations happened. You just can't do that. So we can have differential mutation rates. We can have defective DNA repair enzymes. We can have radiation. We can have Shem, Ham, and Japheth with 1 or 2 or 3 Y chromosomes. All I'm saying is, in the end, you cannot know where Shem, Ham, and Japheth are on the family tree. Especially when you consider that, for instance, the earliest Y chromosomes in Europe are not the ones that are common today. In fact, the earliest Y chromosomes come from, group I or group J. The most common one today is in group R. Most people are trying to separate Shem, Ham, and Japheth on the tree. That means that maybe Shem got into Europe first. But then again, the earliest ones are Neanderthals, and they branch off apparently from Africans, some Africans, not all. But what's happening here? What's happening is history is really complicated, and it's really hard to look at the archaeology and pull DNA out and say, I have found a signal for the table of nations. This is the descendants of Japheth moving into Iceland, or the descendants of Shem moving into China. It doesn't quite work that way, Christians. We have to do more thinking. It's more complicated. It actually means that it's more interesting. It's not boring and easy to figure out. It's hard and fun. Oh, there's one more thing. I've done a biblical genetics episode on this. I have an article on creation.com. I call it patriarchal drive. Now, I originally conceived that as a way to increase mutation rates early on post-flood and then slow down. And it is this. Really old people have children with more mutations than young people. Specifically in men, the spermatogonia start dividing at puberty, and they don't stop dividing until the man dies. So the older the man is, the more generations his reproductive cells have gone through, and the more likely it is that they're going to carry mutations. So older men carry more mutations than younger men. Older men produce children with more mutations than younger men. The patriarchs lived a really long time. if the mutation rates in them was anything similar to the mutation rate of modern men today, then those patriarchs were producing children with a huge mutation load if they had children late in life. Noah was 500 years, over 500 years old when Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born. If there were mutations happening before the flood, he would have produced a massive number of mutations. So patriarchal drive in the early post-flood population is just yet another way to increase the mutation rate, to drive separation of the people, potentially to give us long branch attraction and very complex genetics. Stop the presses. I filmed that video well over a week ago in Australia. I'm no longer in Australia. I'm now in New Zealand. And I finally, after all this time, had a morning to sit down and review that video footage. And I realized I left out the single most interesting hypothesis. And that is this. If Shem, Ham, and Japheth are born at different times, let's say that Japheth is first and Ham is born 75 years later. We don't know how old Noah was when each of the sons was born. We know he's at least 500. But there's some significant time gap between them. And let's say Japheth and Ham come from the same spermatogonial cell line, but Shem is from a different one. Well, Shem and Japheth will look different, but Ham could be even more different because Noah's spermatogonial line might have increased in its mutation count, but Ham and Japheth would have the same basic mutations. Ham would just have more. Therefore, when we look at it today in our phylogenetics programs, Ham would look like a descendant of Japheth. So not only could you have 1, 2, or 3 lines, you could have 2 lines that are nested within each other so that you actually would only have 2 apparent lines and the third one would look like a descendant. And it's not. It could be actually one of the brothers. So there's a brand new idea that I thought of and I forgot about it when I was filming. I just rethought about it now, throwing a total monkey wrench into the whole idea that we can know which branch is Shem, which branch is Ham, and which branch is Japheth. All right, back to the show. So what do you think? Can you put Shem, Ham, and Japheth on the family tree? Is it worth trying? Yes, it's worth trying. Okay, I'm going to say that. But can you do it? Should we give up and run away? Or should we just acknowledge that science is often more complicated than we first anticipate? Yeah, I think that's what we should do. And let's keep on digging. Keep on digging. If you want more information, you can look up my article, Can We Place the Sons of Noah on the Y-chromosome Family Tree? It's on creation.com. You might want to look at one of my earliest March of 2020 biblical genetics episodes, Mystery of Human Ancestry. I wasn't really good at making videos then. I'm not much better now, but I was really bad then. But you might want to go look at that old one. There'll be a link in the show notes. Or in Geeking Out About DNA Damage Repair. That was in June of 2023. That was a lot of fun. It is there for you to dig in some more. I tell you what, there is so much complexity in the historical record that the archaeologists, the geneticists, the historians are going to have a long time to keep on studying. But the basic picture is that there was a massive spread of people from the Middle East with one main mitochondrial lineage, that's Y-chromosome, that's mitochondrial Eve, and one Y-chromosome lineage, that should be Noah. But those people, the people today are sitting on long branches. In other words, the basic groups are separated from each other by long branches. I think that's because of patriarchal drive, maybe because of radiation on the ark. But all that does is tell us that there's no molecular clock, that you can't say, oh, this is the mutation rate today, therefore Y-chromosome Noah must have lived 200,000 years ago. Actually, it's true. When you look at the mutation rate today, Y-chromosome Noah lived a few thousand years ago, like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, like he should have, because that's the biblical history. But I don't think there's a molecular clock. I don't think you can take the branching pattern of the tree and say, oh, this happened in 1000 BC. Because I don't know that happened in 1000 BC if the mutation rates have been different over time. And I know I've talked about that also. Hey, thank you for listening. Go check out my article. If you'd like to support biblical genetics, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate all of your encouragement. There will be more coming soon. One more thing. If you notice there's a big gap between my last episode and this episode, it's because I filmed an episode in between 3 separate times on 3 separate occasions, and I never liked the quality. I deleted it each time. I was like, man, I got to do something better. But then a paper came out on an archive that they wanted to be published officially, and 2 different people wrote me and said, Rob, don't do anything on that subject until after that paper is published. Arg. And that was exactly the subject of this episode that I filmed 3 times. So I am working hard to produce content for you. I'm working really hard. I finally carved out an afternoon here in Australia. I already had a conference call early in the morning back to the States. I had another conference call with a person here for 2 hours talking about a new version of cosmology that is working on. We're really busy here at Biblical Genetics and at Creation.com, Creation Ministries International, just trying to produce content to encourage you. And I hope after this long, I've been filming now for 24 minutes, this long, rambling speech, that you're a little bit encouraged that the basic pattern of the Y-chromosome family tree is biblical, but history and biology is complicated enough that we can't necessarily know who the sons of Shem, Ham, or Japheth were in the grave when we pull up their Y-chromosome data. That's all I wanted to say. Have an awesome day.